Welcome to Engaging Cities Fireside Chats. On each episode of the show, I talk to leaders who are paving the way in civic engagement in order to inspire listeners and share strategies that you can implement in your own community. This podcast is proudly supported by our sponsor, Conveo, the engagement platform for plans and policies. Check them out at konveio.com. I'm your host, Kelly Hickler, the Community Manager with Engaging Cities, as well as the founder of Cinovation Studio, which is dedicated to innovative civic education and engagement. Today, I'm talking with Mark Sherman, who is the president of Community Heart and Soul, which is such an apt name, and I think a cute name for a nonprofit organization focused on building stronger small cities and towns across the U.S. through a resident-driven process. Mark discusses the program's approach, which aims to engage a wide range of community voices and facilitate inclusive participation. He also highlights 2 examples where the program has been successfully implemented in Carbondale, Pennsylvania, and Biddeford, Maine. While Community Heart and Soul is limited to officially working with cities of 30,000 people or less, their process is applicable to cities of any size. So no matter what size community you happen to work for or live in, there are lots of helpful tidbits in this episode. And here we go. Hi, Mark. Welcome to the podcast today. Thanks for joining us on Engaging Cities Fireside Chats.
Hi, Kelly. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Yeah. So maybe before we start talking about the work that you do with Community Heart and Soul, you could tell our listeners a bit about yourself, your background. How did you get into what it is that you do?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So I am the president of Community Heart and Soul, which is a nonprofit organization. We're based in Vermont, just outside of Burlington, Vermont, and Shelburne, Vermont. And I actually grew up here. This is kind of home turf for me. And so I grew up in a small town. And then, like a lot of folks in my peer group, I felt the need to leave. So I had the wanderlust and I went out west. In my case, I went to Seattle, Washington, where I attended graduate school. And my intention was always to come back to Vermont at some point. But I just wanted to see the world and kind of get away. But I always felt the heartstrings of Vermont, the lifestyle here, the commitment to the environment, the community values really pulling at me. And finally, it took a while. My wife, who's also from Vermont, and I found our way back home. And when I got back here, I had worked in the technology sector in Seattle, and then I'd also worked in a nonprofit, which I found enormously satisfying. I really was attracted to mission-driven work. And when I came back to Vermont, I almost by accident, I was connected with the founder of Community Heart and Soul, a gentleman named Lyman Orton, who was a very successful businessman with his sons, started something called the Vermont Country Store, which is a very popular, previously a mail order catalog, but now more of an internet-based business. And Lyman had this vision of building this community development program, and I was very attracted to it. And it was also very personal for me because part of the objective was to strengthen small cities and towns like those in our state by making it more attractive for people to want to stay or to return home, which was exactly what I ended up doing, and to attract new residents. So long-winded way of saying I'm local. I kind of went away, as many people do, and then I came home, and here I am leading this wonderful work.
Yeah, it's a familiar story of the kind of the alchemist, right? The
Exactly.
the voyage to explore the world and ultimately come back home. So I appreciate that. You mentioned the name Orton, and I feel like I've heard that before. There's a Orton Family Foundation or something of
That's
that.
correct. So that was the original name of our organization, but we've changed it to Community Heart and Soul, which is the name of the program that we developed and that we continue to support and promote. So that is really what we're known by now. Community Heart and Soul. Our website is communityheartandsoul.org. But the founder is a gentleman named Lyman Orton. So that's probably where you saw the name. Yeah.
Okay, I see. So, let's get into talking about community heart and soul and what kind of work do you do? What's your approach? What's your philosophy?
Sure. I'll just give you a thumbnail sketch of the program, and then feel free to stop me or ask any questions along the way. But just at a very high level, Community Heart and Soul is a resident-driven process. So really focusing on the residents that engages the entire population of a town in identifying what they love most about their community, the future that they want for it, and how to achieve it. So it sort of boils down to uh, that idea, that philosophy, if you will. We're currently in over 120 towns and small cities across the United States. So it's really taken off, and there are a lot in the pipeline. And our mission is to really continue to expand the program. It's really based on three core principles. The principles are involve everyone, focus on what matters most to residents, and then playing the long game. So that's the philosophical underpinnings of the program. The program itself is a very structured blueprint for community revitalization. It's broken out into four phases, and it's led by a coach. So we train the coaches, we develop the program, we train and certify and recertify coaches. And the coaches can be either independent, like consultants who are working with the community, or in many cases, they're actually staff members of partner organizations like community foundations and humanities councils. They actually work in these organizations, and this is part of the service that they provide. But the coaches lead the communities through these four phases, and I'll just quickly go through what the four phases are.
Yeah,
So the
wonderful.
first one is really a visioning process. We call it Imagine, where the heart and soul teams are formed, and they, build awareness for the program. They gauge interest within the community, and they try and build commitment in all segments of the community, not just the residents, but local partners, and very importantly, town officials as well.
Mhm.
Second phase is one of connection. So we call it Connect. And we use story gathering. And so we sit down and we do very in-depth story gathering. We interview, I say we, the residents are actually doing this work, uh, fellow residents about what they love about the community. What would they like to see changed or improved? What would it take to make them want to stay there or return, and that sort of thing. So those are very rich stories, and those are boiled down into what we call heart and soul statements. And that's the third phase. So we call it plan, where the heart and soul statements are formed based on these rich stories. And these are really the heart and soul statements. You can think of them as the guiding principles for the future of the town. And they're really meant to endure.
Mhm.
And so the heart and soul statements are crafted by the community. They're vetted by the community, and they're often appear on the town chamber walls as a reminder to local officials about what matters most to the community. And then the final phase is act, and act meaning these statements are turned into action plans. And the action plans they can be short term, medium term, long term, but this is really where the rubber meets the road. It's not an abstract process. I mean, it really boils down to a very specific set of actions that produce some wonderful outcomes. Some of them, I would say, are more on the social end of the spectrum, and
Mhm.
some are more economic. But it's usually a mix of the two. But one important point about our program is that we are nonpartisan. There's no political, social, or religious agenda. We are simply a framework that helps communities identify their priorities and then turn them into actions. So I'm happy to say more about the principles or the phases of community heart and soul, but that is the big picture. That's the overview. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. That's so fascinating, and I'm curious, what is usually the impetus to for a community to launch into this effort?
Right. So oftentimes it starts with word of mouth. I mean, what we found is that when we're introduced in a new community, often surrounding communities hear about it, They'll learn about it. Of course, they may read about it on the internet. They may watch a podcast like this, and it's a kernel of an idea that germinates into typically local community organizing. A group of people get together and say, "Gosh, this looks like something that we could really benefit from." They may bring in a coach to do an introductory session, learn more about it. It does require a commitment of time and resources. Uh, a lot of this is volunteer hours. We have residents that sign up for participation on the Heart and Soul team and so on. But pretty soon it mobilizes and it catches on, and then the word spreads. So that's how it typically gets started.
Okay. Is it frequently tied to a long range planning effort, like a community's updating their comprehensive plan or some other sort
Uh,
of.
that's a great question.
Mhm.
Often it is. It
Okay.
often is kind of the community engagement component of the comprehensive planning process. But actually, this may be a good time to tell you about the origin of this. You
Oh,
asked about the founder earlier,
yeah.
and I think this gave you some really great insight into how it came to be and why it's structured the way it is. So the origin story, if you will, as I mentioned, it started with Lyman Orton, who, with his sons, founded the Vermont Country Store, a very successful business in Southern Vermont. Well, as a successful business guy, Lyman was invited to participate in his local town planning commission. This is in the town of Weston, Vermont, population 600. So very small, right?
Mm.
And what happened was there was a very divisive proposal that came before the town to develop a wildlife theme park on the side of a mountain, which was kind of a random proposal. In southern Vermont, where it gets pretty wintry in the winter months,
Yeah.
but nobody really showed up to protest the proposal, and it passed. And once it passed, as Lyman is fond of saying, the scars on the side of the mountain healed before the scars within the community. And of course, the project failed within 6 months. So it was a big teaching moment, I think, for not only for the community, but also for Lyman. And I think he felt like there has to be a better way to engage the residents in defining like what is really important, what's the future going to be. And that really gave birth to the idea behind Community Heart and Soul. So one of the things that I think Lyman recognized early on was that you had to have this be a resident driven process, but you also had to have participation by local government. So we ask localities to pass a municipal resolution of support
Mm.
when we start the program, which is very important. Of course, they're invited to have a seat at the table, but the process itself is really driven by the residents. And one of the great things about the outcome of the program is it gives town officials a really clear vision of what matters most to the residents. So in some ways, it's really increasing their confidence that the investments that they're going to make or that they're going to support are aligned with what people really care about.
Mhm.
And having worked in both business and in the nonprofit world, that's just that's a real gem to have that sort of insight, to really know that what you're doing is being driven by the market or the community. That's very valuable. And so that's the story behind it. And yes, it often is used to inform comprehensive plans.
Okay.
And hopefully that answers your question.
Okay. Yeah. Do you oftentimes work alongside other consultants who've been hired by the city, by the town to to do the planning work or create the document?
No, not really. I mean, the independent consultants who typically do, a comprehensive plan. I mean, our this isn't to disparage anybody, but oftentimes what we see is those plans sit on the shelf. They may do a little bit of outreach, and then they end up being shelved. So we are very happy to inform those plans with all of the information that we collect from the community.
Mhm.
But I wouldn't say that we really work closely with independent consultants who are doing that type of work. We think this is a different approach. We think it's a very valuable approach, and we think it enhances their work. So that's sort of the frame
Okay.
that we approach it with.
I see. And this, you mentioned your nonprofit and a lot of or most of the work is volunteer hours, but is there a cost associated for the town that they have to pay a fee?
Yes, there are some costs, and I'm glad you asked me about it. So one of the ways, by the way, that we defray the costs that we help communities get started is we have a grant program. We call it the seed grant, seed like, planting a seed.
Mhm.
And it's a $10,000 matching grant. And communities can apply very easily for it on our website. We don't make them jump through a lot of hoops. I mean, obviously, there's some uh, restrictions and qualifications and expectations and that sort of thing. But it's a great way for the community to overcome the initial hurdle of, oh, there are some expenses. But let me tell you what the expenses are. There's three categories. So one is the coach, which in some cases is not a fee. There is no fee because if they're lucky enough to work in a state where there's a community foundation that has people on staff who've already been trained to do community heart and soul, or in the case of, for example, the state of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania Humanities, they have two coaches who are trained on staff. They can provide coaching at no cost, which is great. But in other areas, they may pay a coach some fee for
Okay.
their coaching expertise. Then the second category is something called project coordination. So there's
Mhm.
a lot of moving pieces when the heart and soul process gets going. And this is typically an 18 to 24-month training process. The process itself is ongoing. We really see this as in perpetuity, but the training, the four phases I talked about, typically are 1.5 to 2 years. That's the length of time most communities are working. So during that time, we highly recommend that a project coordinator, somebody who is scheduling gatherings, community input, keeping, the project on track, be
Mhm.
hired. Sometimes that's done on a volunteer basis, but, that can be a potential cost. And then the third cost is really just project expenses, things like poster boards and pens and pizzas and childcare and maybe a room rental, just your
Yeah,
typical stuff.
got you.
So
Oh,
we try and keep the costs to an absolute minimum, but there are some costs involved. And
okay.
those costs are often, um, you know, the contributors for those could be individuals like philanthropists within the community. They could be nonprofit partners. Oftentimes, towns kick in money.
Mhm.
They may have a bake sale and all of the above.
I love that. Can any town apply for this, or are there limitations on the qualifications?
Right. So we do best in communities with populations of 30,000 or less. And
Okay.
so we used to have a lower limit. We used to say, to get a seed grant, you had to have at least 2,500 people. But honestly, the market told us that was not the right approach. There were lots of communities with populations under 2,500, and they were like, "We want to do this. That's crazy." So
Mm.
we listened to the market, and we did away with that. As long as there is some kind of incorporated, some sort of municipal structure.
Okay.
A lot of our hard and soul communities are quite small. I think the average is around 5 or 6,000, but that, on the low end, there are communities that are well under 1,000. And then we have larger ones that are approaching 30,000. So that gives you some sense of range.
Yeah. So maybe it'd be interesting now to talk about a few specific examples of projects that Community Heart and Soul has worked on.
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, there's really a spectrum of benefits that accrue, within towns, and it varies from town to town. It really depends on what their priorities are. But I would just say in broad strokes, the social and the economic, and I'll give you an example of each. So on the social, we're talking about things like increased civic engagement. I think that's the core payoff. And that results in a lot more in volunteerism, more people running for local office. Increased civility and pride, I think, is really important, especially given our current situation here in the United
Mm.
States where things are pretty divided right now.
Yes.
Again, this is an asset-based frame where we're looking about we're interested in hearing what people love about their community, the future they want for it. It's a very optimistic approach. It's not an opportunity to air a bunch of grievances. That's not what we do.
Mhm.
And that dynamic removes a lot of the, friction that might occur otherwise. And what we find is that people, when they focus on what they care about, with their love for community, a lot of the the civility increases and a lot of the ill will just sort of dissipates. And so I think that that is actually an enormous benefit. But here's an example that comes to mind, one of many. There's a community in Carbondale, Pennsylvania, and they used to really struggle when they had an opening on their town council to get anybody to run for office. They
Okay.
had to have, like, beg, borrow, and steal, recruit, whatever. And the project coordinator, who's a terrific guy, said that after they did Community Heart and Soul and they had an opening, 18 people applied for the position. So,
Really? Wow.
bingo. I mean, that's a pretty dramatic increase. So let's shift gears over to the economic end of the spectrum. So we often see, increased investment in the community as a result of the process. A lot of new businesses open. People are more optimistic. It's almost like the consumer confidence index goes up. And a great example is the town of Biddeford, Maine. And Biddeford had the reputation of, it used to be referred to as trash town because they had this enormous incinerator right in the middle of town.
Okay.
And the difficulty there was they employed more people than any other business in the community. They had
Okay.
80 people working there, and it was very important to the tax base. But it really, the residents didn't like it. They had this reputation for being trash town. So after doing Community Heart and Soul, the community said, we want this thing to go. And I would say it mustered enough public will to get the town to agree to buy the property and tear down the incinerator, which was a risky move,
Wow. Yeah.
but not so risky because it turned out since the completion of Heart and Soul, they've documented $90 million in approved projects that are in the pipeline. The vacancy on their main street has dropped dramatically. Their business and industrial parks are nearly full. The commercial real estate value has seen a 60% increase. Residential values are up 12%. And they were actually named by, there's another organization that we're very fond of called Main Street America. And the American Main Street Program, they gave Biddeford their National Main Street Award 2 years ago, based on the transformation that they experienced through all of these
Oh, that's
changes.
incredible.
So those are some examples, and it really varies enormously. But I would invite your listeners to go to our website. There's a menu called Towns, and there's a map of the United States. You click on the states, it gives you a whole list of towns. And when you click on those towns, you will see town profiles, you'll see information that will give you very specific accomplishments, achievements about the communities that you might be most interested in.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's great. Okay, so one more time for listeners, it's communityheartandsoul.org.
Correct. Communityheartandsoul.org. And we're very eager to talk to anybody who's interested in learning more, uh, put them in touch with folks who've already been through the program, uh, educate them about the seed grant opportunity. Our mission is really to expand this to as many communities as possible across the United States. We're very passionate about our work. We love this program and we just want to see it spread.
Yeah, that's great. Hopefully some of our listeners will take you up on that and you'll get some emails, phone calls.
That would be great.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm curious if there's a larger community that's more than the 30,000 person limit to officially go through your program, are there some takeaways or best practices or words of advice that you could give to a larger community that they might be able to implement that kind of follows along with your approach or your philosophy?
Well, I think a lot of the work that we do would benefit larger communities. And honestly, we get a lot of inquiries from uh, large cities that want to
Okay.
do this work. We
Yeah.
just find that the approach, our particular approach, works best in these smaller cities. But I would say go to our website, read about how we do our work. I think probably the most important thing is the way that we engage as many residents as possible. I'll just digress for one moment. A
Yeah.
humor. We have
Okay.
a tool we developed called the Community Network Analysis, CNA for short. And it is a tool that helps map all the different groups and segments within a community so that we can identify not just all the ones that are most visible, but the less visible ones, the missing voices that are often not present when
Right.
you're asking folks what really matters about their community. And this tool, the community network analysis, is a great way of identifying not only who the groups are, but connectors. So if you have a heart and soul team, but there is not somebody on the team that's currently connected to one of these groups. And these could be both formal and informal groups. I mean, a formal group maybe the Rotarians or the veterans group, but there are also informal groups, folks that get together for coffee at the local general store on Monday mornings, etc.
Yeah.
And it's a great way of making sure that all those hidden and missing voices feel that are welcomed. And by the way, I'll add one last thing. When we do our work, we're very intentional about trying to make it as easy as possible for people to participate in community heart and soul. So we don't just have one or two meetings, and if you don't show up, you miss out on it. We're constantly organizing gatherings. And we're very fond of saying, instead of inviting people to the table, we bring the table to the people. What does that mean? So that means we do block parties, we meet at local businesses, schools, churches, community events, wherever the people congregate. And our local teams will set up a booth. They'll be there to interview people, to gather their stories, to share information about the program. And I think those kinds of things really could be very useful for even larger communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Have found that usually is a way better approach, more enjoyable too. Who wants to, not even staff wants to come to a community meeting at City Hall.
Exactly.
It's much more fun. Make it a fun event, and if you could tie it into something that's already happening that people are going to be at and that they would enjoy attending, all the better.
And bring food and
Y-
provide child.
Yes, right, exactly. Okay, Mark, thank you so much for all of your insights and sharing your program with our listeners. I really hope that we inspired some people to take action, whether they become an official partner or not. Um, so so thanks again. And we'll hopefully have maybe we can have some of the participants in the program come talk on a
Kelly, it
future
would be a pleasure. I mean, it's one thing to hear from me, but to hear from people who have actually participated, I think really makes this real. So I would invite you to check back with me. I'd be happy to bring some folks who have participated, maybe a coach or two. But thank you so much for the opportunity to share this with your listeners. It's been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. All right. As always, thank you, listeners, for tuning in. And thanks again to our generous sponsor, Conveo. Head on over to engagingcities.org, where you can find additional episodes and other helpful resources related to community engagement. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.